Karmelo Anthony reportedly fantasized about knives and stabbing someone in the hours before he killed Austin Metcalf.
Put his hands on me. I told him not to. He put his hands on me.
It is a bombshell update from prosecutors in an appeal hearing today over Anthony's attempt to have his murder conviction overturned.
What's your name, man? Karmelo Anthony, K-A-R-M-E-L-O.
What this means for Anthony's efforts to argue that his original trial was unfair.
A single text message. I'm low, key on the verge. Sent hours, just hours, before a 17-year-old took his last breath under a high school tent in Frisco, Texas. If that sentence had reached 12 ordinary jurors, would Karmelo Anthony be free right now? That's the question sitting at the center of a hearing, playing out in a Texas courtroom this week. A hearing that could unravel everything about the murder trial. Here's what you need to understand before anything else. In April 2025, at a high school track meet outside Dallas, an argument under a team tent ended in a single stab wound to the heart. Metcalf reportedly shoved Anthony to get him to leave. Anthony, according to trial testimony, pulled a knife from his backpack in response. And within seconds, a teenager was dead.
Karmelo Anthony is requesting a new trial, and today is day 2 of a hearing in Texas to decide if he's going to get one. He was convicted of stabbing fellow track athlete Austin Metcalf to death at a track meet, high school track meet in Frisco, Texas in April of last year, right outside of Dallas.
He put his hands on me.
Now that's the body cam video of the aftermath of the incident, and you'll remember that Anthony ended up under Metcalf's team's tent as this meet was going on, the two of them reportedly exchanging words, and when Metcalf gets up to physically remove Karmelo Anthony from that tent, he shoves Karmelo Anthony, and there was that blurry surveillance video that showed it, and in response, a split second, Anthony takes a knife out of his backpack and stabs Austin Metcalf once in the heart, killing him.
The jury deliberated for 3 hours. They convicted him. He's currently serving a 35-year sentence. Case closed, right? That's what most of the public assumed, until this week. Because right now, Anthony has a new legal team. A high-profile one. And they're arguing that the trial you thought you understood was never the full story.
You may remember back in June, during Karmelo Anthony's murder trial, there was not much testimony at all about who he is. No witnesses vouching for his character, no talk of his background. And Anthony's new attorneys are arguing that's because his defense made a gentleman's agreement with prosecutors to only focus on the moments surrounding the fatal stabbing of Austin Metcalf at a track meet. They wanted to, in their words, keep it under the tent.
Here's the detail that should stop you cold-eye. Prosecutors have now revealed, in open court, that Anthony allegedly sent messages in the hours before the killing. Messages describing fantasies involving knives, involving stabbing, even, reportedly, licking blood from a blade. The jury that convicted him never heard a word of it.
These text messages and evidence that prosecutors talked about today, and these are things that the jury did not know about. I mean, none of us knew about it until now. You have local media outlets like WFAA and NBC DFW who are in the courtroom today for this hearing, who are giving information, live updates about a lot of the testimony that's happening. And we have to talk about what Assistant District Attorney for Collin County, Bill Werski, had to say and what he claims happened in the hours before this track meet on the day that Austin Metcalf lost his life. Because he says that Karmelo Anthony's girlfriend, hours before, told an assistant principal at their high school that the couple had broken up and that she said she allegedly was afraid. She claimed that Karmelo Anthony was stalking her. WFAA says that the ADA also claimed today in the courtroom that Anthony was allegedly obsessed with guns, fights, and knives. And prosecutors allegedly have a text message that Anthony sent where he fantasized about stabbing someone and licking the blood off the blade. And he allegedly sent a text that said, quote, "I'm low-key on the verge." Anthony stabbed Austin Metcalf to death hours later. The jury never heard that.
Ask yourself, if you were sitting in that jury box, deciding whether to send a young man away for decades, wouldn't you want to know that? So why didn't the jury know? This is where the case turns strange, and where, if you've followed true crime for any length of time, you'll recognize something you don't see very often. Behind closed doors, without a judge, without any written record, prosecutors and Anthony's original defense team reportedly struck what both sides are now calling a gentleman's agreement, a verbal handshake. Nothing on paper. The deal: keep the case narrow. Focus only on what happened under that tent. In exchange for prosecutors staying quiet about Anthony's alleged texts, his ex-girlfriend's reported claims that she was afraid of him, and a stint in a juvenile anger management program years earlier. The defense reportedly agreed not to introduce anything about Austin Metcalf's past, including allegations of racist graffiti and a reported history of aggression.
Hours later, the jury never heard that. Now, the ADA also reportedly says that Anthony had gone to a program for juveniles when he was younger who struggle with anger. That was something that was not presented in court during his trial. Now, this appears to be the reason that prosecutors and Carmelo's defense made what they're calling a gentleman's agreement not to insert character testimony into the case. Again, they're calling it a gentleman's agreement. The assistant district attorney for Collin County reportedly said that the deal went both ways, because in exchange for not talking about Karmelo Anthony's ex-girlfriend, that text message, his life when he was still living in Louisiana, where he went to some sort of juvenile program for young people who struggle with anger, they say that there were things that the defense didn't bring up about Austin Metcalf's past. The ADA says that Metcalf allegedly put, quote, vile racist stuff on graffiti, and that was not presented to the jury. The defense alleges that Metcalf also had a history of being aggressive, and that was something that the defense for Karmelo Anthony, they weren't able to talk about during the trial. Now, the reason the prosecutor said that this deal was reached between both sides, it was not to add fuel to the fire. I mean, you saw the amount of attention during this trial from individuals that typically aren't covering true crime. I mean, there was political talk of this. This made its way into racial discussions in this country. And the prosecutor says they didn't want any of that to factor into what was happening in the courtroom.
Both sides, allegedly, agreed to keep it under the tent. In the exact words used in that courtroom, if you're already uncomfortable, you're not alone. Because here's the problem. That's not how the justice system is supposed to work. Evidence isn't supposed to be filtered by a handshake between opposing lawyers. It's supposed to go in front of a judge, who rules on what a jury lawfully hears. When two lawyers quietly decide that for themselves, with no transcript, no oversight, and the defendant apparently not even present for the conversation, who's actually protecting the truth.
But it does a couple of different things in terms. Somebody's going to lose the trial, so somebody's going to be angry. But if prosecutors lose, they don't get to appeal. So it always falls on the other side, right? So you've lost the trial. Now you start taking a look back at everything that happened. And this is the opportunity to take another look and try to get another bite at the apple and question the decisions that were made first time through. But when you think about that evidence, I mean, that evidence would be powerful if the jury heard about what he was allegedly texting about beforehand, involving knives and blood, and that would be very problematic for Karmelo Anthony and his defense. Understandably, they want to do everything they can to keep it out. But usually, these are the types of issues that it's not like a handshake deal. Okay, you don't do this, we won't do that. It's like you have hearings before the trial, and the judge decides what's admissible and what's not admissible. Like a deal like this sounds very unusual to me, especially in a high-profile case like this, for there to be some sort of handshake deal on you don't do this and we won't do that and we'll just go forward, as opposed to what evidence should lawfully come before the jury and what evidence should not lawfully come before a jury. That's the way it's done, like in almost every other case, which, again, that in and of itself could become a problem here for this case.
Well, and it seems like it goes both ways too. And I don't know which one would have been more damning. I mean, certainly the idea that Carmelo Anthony allegedly was talking about knives in the hours before, and it was going through this breakup, which, like, you look at someone's state of mind. I mean, he's, potentially having a bad day already. He's tense. And then he has this knife. And then he sends a text message saying that he was on the verge. That there. And then hours later, if that was presented to the jury, and you're sitting there, you're like, okay, I can see why the defense was like, let's just do everything we possibly can that this does not reach a jury. On the other hand, apparently Austin Metcalf, according to prosecutors, had a history when it came to some racist graffiti, and that could have been inserted in the trial. So that was kind of the agreement back and forth. But if I'm a juror today on this, and though they reached the decision of Carmelo Anthony being guilty of the murder of Austin Metcalf, I still would have felt today a little bit gypped. Where it's I would have appreciated understanding, like, that to me is major context of what led up to being under the tent. And I would be frustrated that there was a sense, I hate using the word gamesmanship because that's like a sports term. And we're talking about lives and murder and all of that.
And here's where the story escalates again. According to Anthony's new attorneys, that agreement collapsed on the final day of testimony, right before Anthony would have taken the stand in his own defense. Prosecutors allegedly declared the deal dead, claiming the defense had already broken it by mentioning, of all things, that Anthony liked playing chess. Everything, prosecutors said, was now back on the table. Anthony was reportedly given 10 minutes to decide whether to testify. 10 minutes. To weigh whether to speak in his own defense. Knowing that the moment he did, jurors could hear about the texts, the ex-girlfriend's fear, the anger program, all of it. He chose not to testify. And in a case where self-defense was an issue, the jury never heard from Carmelo Anthony himself.
The defense is arguing, though, this gentleman's agreement, and I'm talking about Carmelo's new defense, they're arguing that the agreement restricted witnesses from being able to testify that could have helped Carmelo Anthony tell his side of the story, like an expert on epilepsy, to talk about how that impacted, in their opinion, Carmelo Anthony's potential perception of a threat. He was diagnosed with epilepsy, apparently. Here's another part of it. There's really no record of it. It wasn't written out. It was only verbal between both sides because they did not want the media, for example, getting wind of it and reporting about it as the buildup to this trial went on. Another argument that Anthony's new legal defense team is making in their appeal is looking at whether Anthony was someone who had his rights violated when he did not testify in his own defense. Now, in a lot of self-defense cases, you see the person who's involved in the altercation get on the stand and tell their side of the story. But that didn't happen in this case. And the defense says on the last day of witness testimony in this trial, so right before Carmelo would have testified in his own defense, the prosecution declared that gentleman's agreement deal dead. Because they say, the prosecution, that the defense had already violated that deal and opened the door back during opening statements because they mentioned that Carmelo Anthony liked playing chess. Now, the defense says that Carmelo was then given, after the prosecution said everything's on the table, Carmelo Anthony was given 10 minutes to decide whether he wanted to testify in his own defense. And now that we know what prosecutors allegedly had, like those messages and the situation involving his girlfriend, talk of stabbing, fantasizing about those things, a history where potentially he was in some sort of program for kids who struggled with anger, all of that without this deal, that was going to be on the table, would have been fair game. And the defense said that because of that, Carmelo decided not to testify in his own defense. And to this point, the rest is history in a lot of ways. The jury took 3 hours, found him guilty of murdering Austin Metcalf.
If you noticed something wrong with that picture before I even said it, you were already ahead of most of the courtroom that day. Because it doesn't end there. The judge who oversaw that original trial, who also decided to bar cameras, bar audio recording, and limit public seating to roughly 24 people, in a case that drew national attention, has now been removed from hearing Anthony's request for a new trial. Why? His own legal team argues the judge showed bias, pointing to an interview he gave days after the verdict, where he stated flatly that the jury Got it right.
And Carmelo Anthony is now serving as much as 35 years in a Texas prison. Now, before I get Vinny Politan on here again from Court TV, I also want to talk about another big development that came in the last day in this case, because the judge who oversaw the original trial, his name is John Roach, he's been removed from overseeing this appeals process. Carmelo's legal team says that Roach was biased toward the courtroom verdict. In an interview with local TV station WFAA TV, and this was days after the verdict, this is part of what Roach said.
Yeah, they did. You know why? Because they were picked based upon the law. They listened to the facts that happened here in this very courtroom, and they got a verdict. And so that's the process. And whatever they say, they get it right.
A sitting judge, commenting publicly on a case that hadn't even finished its appeals, before the ink on the conviction was dry. Add it up, an off-the-record deal nobody wrote down, a defendant given 10 minutes to decide his own fate, a judge speaking publicly about a verdict he isn't supposed to weigh in on anymore. Each piece on its own might be explainable. Together, they start to look like something else entirely. A case where the process itself may not have been fair, regardless of what actually happened under that tent.
If the defense loses here, it's part of the appeal. It's not good. It's not the way the system should work. Everything should be above board. There should not be secret deals or, handshake agreements. If you want the evidence in, put the evidence in. If you don't want the evidence in, don't put it in. That's what the judge gets paid to do, to make those decisions. That's the way it's set up. You, as the defense, are supposed to do anything and everything to get evidence in front of the jury to protect your client. The prosecution is supposed to have a search for the truth and put the evidence in there that demonstrates what really happened. And when they start engaging in gamesmanship, and the defense engages in gamesmanship, and the defendant is kind of left out of the loop of all of that, that's a problem. That's a violation of his rights, not by the state, but by his own attorney. And that becomes a huge problem. And it's a stain on the case at this point, and very well could undermine the entire trial, which they'll have to do over again if this thing is overturned at any point.
And that's really the heart of what this hearing is about. Not whether Austin Metcalf died, that's not in dispute. Not even, entirely, whether Anthony held the knife. That's not in dispute either. What's in dispute is whether the 12 people, asked to weigh his fate, were given the full and true picture, or a version of it quietly negotiated by attorneys who decided, on their own, what a jury was allowed to know.
So you have Judge John Roach, who yesterday was accused from this. And I know I've used the term appeal, like what we're talking about here. This is a motion for a new trial. So just for people, non-lawyers like myself, like where are we in the state of, like, we have this 2-day hearing, may go another day at the time we're recording this, about all these concerns the defense has. Carmelo has already filed a notice of appeal. Like, what happens next in terms of the efforts of Carmelo Anthony and his team to try and get his conviction thrown out?
Yeah, so this is really the first bite at the apple, right? If you're a criminal defendant and you lose, you go before the same judge who oversaw the trial, and you ask for a new trial based upon mistakes that were made. And it's rare that it gets granted, because you're basically asking the trial judge to redo the trial that he just did because he or she made some mistakes along the way, right? So it's like a judge overturning himself or herself. And that's kind of why you don't usually win these. But in this case, because the judge has recused himself and is out of the loop, you've got a new judge that is hearing this. So it's almost like getting an actual appeal, because you're going before a different judge on issues involving the trial court. So that's step one. If they lose here, then they've filed the notice of appeal. That's the process that takes a little bit longer, because you've got to file the notice of appeal. You've got to get the transcript of the trial. Then you've got to write these very meticulous briefs, and there's a briefing schedule that is set up for each side to file their papers and respond to the other side. Then they set up oral arguments, and then the appellate court listens to the oral arguments, and then they, somewhere down the road, make their decision. This will be a lot quicker this is the first bite of the apple, but it's not the last if Carmelo Anthony loses.
Because somewhere in all of this is a 17-year-old who will never run another race. Friends and coaches who remember Austin Metcalf not as a case file, but as a teammate. The kid who showed up to a track meet like any other Friday, expecting to go home afterward. That's the part it's easy to lose in the legal back and forth. A family is still waiting for something that feels like the whole truth on both sides of this. So here's what I want to leave you with. If a gentleman's agreement, made in private, can decide what a jury of ordinary citizens is allowed to hear before they send someone away for possibly the rest of his life, what does that actually say about who controls the truth in American courtroom? Is it the judge? Is it the jury? Or is it whichever two lawyers happen to shake hands in a hallway?
Just lastly, Vinny, the judge, he was recused from this case. He gives this interview a couple days after the verdict. And in that interview, he gives this answer. Here's the judge who restricted media access and all of that for whatever reason. But then he's asked, do you think that, this was a fair verdict in the case? And he says it was fair because the jury reached it and it was a fair trial. And then Carmelo's team argues, well, that shows bias to the verdict that happened in your courtroom. You don't hear judges often talk. You don't. What did you make of, I guess, why would he do this interview?
I'm shocked. I'm absolutely shocked. You don't want the world to see you working, attempting to do your job on the bench, but then you let them see you when you can control the conversation and you do an interview with the media. It's bizarre. It's rare. There's some states where the judges never talk about cases that they're involved in. In some instances, they may talk about them after the case has gone through the entire appellate process. But this one didn't even go through the motion for a new trial, and he's speaking already. Very unusual, unorthodox, and in most states, you would never, ever see that happen. So I was surprised, and potentially another problem in the case for this conviction to be upheld. It's just another problem. The judge himself created another issue.
Tell me in the comments, do you think Karmelo Anthony deserves a new trial? Or do you think this is a defense team looking for any crack in the wall? And stay close, because there's another detail from this same hearing about who was and wasn't allowed inside that courtroom that I haven't gotten to yet. And it might be the most telling part of this entire case.